Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of Incredible Minds. I'm James P. Barbieri, Program Coordinator here at the PARI Center and your host for the next few weeks. Any issues, please let me know in the chat and I'll try and help you. Just very briefly, a quick reminder to mute your microphones to ensure good quality audio. We do encourage you all to turn on your cameras. It's always nice to see everyone's faces. And the chat is, of course, open, so feel free to share your thoughts and ideas with the rest of the group throughout the session. And of course, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and you should all receive the link in a few days to these recordings to catch up anything that you may have missed. So today, we have the honor of being joined by Lars Chittka, who has his presentation entitled The Mind of a Bee. Lars is the author of the book, The Mind of a Bee, and Professor of Sensory and Behavior Ecology at Queen Mary College of the University of London. He is also the founder of the Research Center for Psychology at Queen Mary. He is known for his work on evolution of sensory systems and cognition using insect-flower interactions as a model system. Chittka has also made fundamental contributions to our understanding of animal cognition and its impact on evolutionary fitness, studying bumblebees and honeybees. And with that, I'll give the floor to you. A very warm welcome.
All right, thank you very much for this kind introduction. And let me share the goods that I've got here. Can you now all see something that looks like a cover slide? Very good, very good. All right, so yeah, as you just heard, I've spent the last few decades exploring the sensory worlds, the intelligence of insects. But why have I recently got presumptuous enough to refer to the minds of bees? Surely that's a bit of a stretch for something like an insect, and so I'll explain a little bit what I'll explore. So I'll focus obviously on some things, as many as I can squeeze into about an hour. So as you know, by the way, we have 2 hours altogether, of which I'll spend an hour lecturing, so to speak, and then the plan is for 1 hour of questions. But if somewhere in the middle of it, you suddenly find yourself stuck because I haven't explained something properly, just feel free to raise a hand and shout. Just switch your microphone on and don't worry about interrupting. It's my job to explain things properly. So if I fail, then let me know. All right. So what I'll talk about today in the context of bees is I want to ask if they have representations of mental representations of things, of space, and of things in space. I want to explore the extent to which they have, as opposed to perhaps a robotic animal that has just access to current sensory input. I want to ask if bees also have access to the past and also the future, whether they can plan for at least the immediate future in a manner that shows an appreciation of the outcomes of their own actions. And in the other time direction, whether they have flexible access to past memories. And finally, and maybe most controversially, I want to ask if bees could be said to have emotion-like states attached to certain spatial settings. There are other things that people who are interested in animal minds, including bees' minds, have also explored that I won't cover today, which is metacognition, for example, the question of whether you know your own knowledge, you're certain about whether you know something or not, the question of attention, a kind of inner eye to focus on certain things that you want to look out for, as well as the question of representing mentally time and number. Won't be in this presentation. We've published on these things, but we won't talk about them today. Now, I think people in general tend to be aware that social insects can do very impressive things. Here's a comparison between a termite hill and the famous cathedral, La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. And the idea, though, is even though these architectures look distantly reminiscent of each other, the idea in the general appreciation is that they come about, these architectures come about by completely different pathways in the human animal and the insect. And the difference is that people think that in the case of human-made architectures, there's a plan, there's an architect who dreams up the whole thing from the start and then makes drawings of what he wishes the entire product to look like. In the end, hands these plans down to builders and engineers and so on. They put his vision into practice. Whereas, so the common thinking goes at the other end of the scale. In the insect world, there's no plan whatsoever. There are just interactions between what are considered fairly simple robot-like creatures that know from birth basically how to behave and simply act according to a number of hardwired rules. And the end result is this beautiful construction that we see here on the left. And this perceived dichotomy between a bottom-up self-organization in insects on the one hand and a strictly top-down kind of approach in humans, this dichotomy is what I want to deconstruct a little bit today. Now, the question of whether insect architectures come about by self-organization or some sort of planning is actually quite old. People have been fascinated by this question for centuries, especially when looking at this wonderful construction that is the honeybee comb, shown here on the bottom left. It's a remarkably symmetrical and regular structure. Even if you take a broader perspective across the animal kingdom, no other animal builds anything as magnificently functional and regular, other than the human animal, of course, as does the honeybee. So this is actually a mathematically optimal solution to minimizing material while maximizing stability and storage space and so on. It's also double-sided, so the bottoms of the opposite cells interface with the ones that we're seeing here, and so on. And Charles Bonnet, a Swiss naturalist, already centuries ago wondered about this question of, in a sense, self-organization, to use a modern term, in the achievement of this construction. He said that placed together in the same room, 10,000 automatons, animated with a living force, and all induced through the perfect resemblance of their outer and inner being, if we admit the least degree of feeling in these automatons, even only such as is necessary for them to be conscious of their own existence, seek their own conservation, avoid noxious things, prepare useful things, etc., their work will not only be regular, well-proportioned, similar, equal, but it will also have symmetry, strength, convenience to the highest point of perfection. Now, this is a curious mix. He, on the one hand, seems to think that such architectures can just come about by sticking all of these 10,000, as he calls them, automatons into a common space. But on the other hand, he seems to take it for granted that they are conscious, that they have feelings and so on, and that somehow, as a result of the interaction between 10,000 conscious and beings equipped with feelings, somehow this architecture will arise just by itself. Now, we know, of course, if we think about this a little bit, that this is certainly not the case. So if we put 10,000 rabbits or fruit flies together in a common space, then we certainly don't get any impressive architecture. So it takes a little bit more than this. And another Swiss naturalist, François Hubert, actually was interested in this question from an experimental point of view. He wanted to know what actually goes on inside a beehive as bees build their magnificent constructions. And the normal scenario inside a hive, or in the cavities where bees naturally nest, at his hollow trees, is that bees start at the top to put the foundations of their comb and then gradually build downwards along the direction of gravity until their two-dimensional construction has reached somewhere near the bottom. And that's when they stop. And this is an ongoing construction that you're seeing here in this image. And the first thing that Hubert and his team noticed when wanting to see what goes on inside the hive, they used glass screens. So they used a glass ceiling, for example, to just inspect the inner workings of a beehive. The first thing they noticed was that the bees don't like very much to attach the foundations of their comb to the slippery surface that is glass. And what the bees then did, instead of starting at the top and building towards the bottom, is they simply inverted the whole construction like a tower. So they started at the bottom and then built their construction gradually upwards. And you might say, well, that's still a repetitive and seemingly robotic process. But if you had built a robot to mimic the natural process, that is, to start at the top and use gravity as a reference to build downwards, that robot would already have fallen flat on its nose with this simple challenge of inverting the whole reference to gravity. So what the bees had to do in this case is to invert the relation to gravity and build upwards. So far, so good. And Hubert and team then thought, all right, let's now make it a little bit harder for the bees. We're introducing now a glass ceiling and a glass floor. So you can't use either as a very good foundation. And the bees in that case simply started on one of the side walls and built their construction laterally through the cavity that was provided to them until they reached the opposite wall. So again, a completely changed reference to gravity, which they normally use in their construction. But the most remarkable thing happened when Hubert and his team introduced an obstacle onto the target wall after the bees had already begun their construction. So the bees have gone halfway built, that takes them several days, halfway into the cavity in the direction of the opposite wall. And normally this comb sheet is always two-dimensional. And a few days later, they would have reached this wall here. And before they did, the team 200 years ago introduced this glass screen as an obstacle. And rather than what the bees might have done then is they continued building, reached the slippery surface, and then perhaps added some additional reinforcement to make sure that the construction doesn't collapse. What they did instead, days before they reached that suboptimal scenario of a slippery surface at the end, is they turned the whole construction 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wood wall. And again, to emphasize, this did not happen in response to reaching a suboptimal surface, but days before they would have reached it. And then they took corrective action to avoid that scenario. And Hubert at the time, 2 centuries ago, exclaimed that I acknowledged that I could not suppress a sentiment of admiration for an action in which the brightest foresight was displayed. So not an insect that's just stuck in the present, but an insect that looks ahead and amends its building according to what a future scenario might hold. Now, these are historic experiments, obviously. They await replication in the present day with larger sample sizes and so on. But the experiments and the approach were highly visionary, of course, for the time. Now, the way we now study bees' cognition, their intelligence and so on, is mostly outside the hive in the context of flower visitation. And so there are a number of things we have to keep in mind that a bee has to cope with on a daily basis. And the first thing is, of course, that they are central place foragers. That is, unlike many other insects, and indeed many other animals, they have a home. They have a house to which they must reliably return, even if they fly several miles, several kilometers away from their native home. They have to make it back. And that's not a trivial pressure because you have to imagine that on your own, as a honeybee, for example, you're dead. You can't survive on your own. You have to find your way back to your community and your communal home. But for the hive, of course, one of perhaps 30,000 bees is not as much a loss as it is from the individual's perspective. But the vast majority of bee species are not actually the familiar social bees, such as honeybees and bumblebees, but solitary bees. There are thousands of species of solitary bees who all build their homes as single mothers, just one mother and her offspring. If any of them forget where they come from, they fail to relocate where their nest is, all their offspring dies, okay? So nature does not tolerate failure in this particular context. They have to be good at relocating their home base. The other big challenge is that bees have to be careful shoppers in the flower supermarket. In the flight range of any one bee nest, there might be several dozen different flower species, all differing in their nectar contents, their quality of nectar and pollen quantity, and bees have to locate those particular flower species or flower patches that offer the highest reward for the least effort, okay? And in doing so, they remember the signposts, the advertising that comes with these rewards. So bees might find, any one bee might find that, in this case, the blue flowers are the most rewarding ones. And after having learned this, she then seeks out the same flowers, these blue flowers, they come also with a particular scent and so on, and disregards other species that she either doesn't know or has already sampled and found out that they're not rewarding. In a sense, that's not dissimilar to how humans judge goods that they collect, that they purchase in a supermarket. So you might have found at some point in your life a favorite brand of toothpaste because you found the product quality good and the price not too prohibitive. And then you remember the packaging and return to the same packaging whenever you're looking for toothpaste again. And basically, that's exactly what the learning bee does when she's looking for familiar flowers. Now, in our laboratory experiments, we, in a sense, just exploit the bee's readiness in associating almost anything with sugary rewards. So what you're seeing here on the right is a bee about to land on a little platform with a droplet of sugar water. And so she lands there a few times, and in this case, behind the platform is the image of a human face. And after she's learned to land there, we can then present the bee with a variety of different faces, like in a crime witness test. We present them side by side or in various spatial arrangements. And of course, in that case, we remove the reward, we shuffle the spatial positions, and then ask, can you now find the correct face, the one that you've previously had a reward in association with? And indeed, it turns out that bees are very good at locating the correct face image after such training. Now, to come back to that spatial challenge, because it's a very important one in a bee's life, and just to make you appreciate how difficult that is, you might all at one point or another have been in a foreign city. This is Shanghai, where perhaps you couldn't read the signs, you couldn't easily ask for directions, and perhaps your phone was also out of charge. So you had to navigate by landmarks. And it can be, you can get lost, of course, in unfamiliar cities, but the task is made relatively easier by the fact that all of these buildings are, of course, made to be memorable landmarks. They're built to stand out from others and to help you memorize them. And that, of course, facilitates navigation tremendously. Now, conversely, here's a landscape near my second home in Mexico City. This is the kind of environment in which animals, including bees, of course, have to navigate on a daily basis. There are no paths here. There are no unique landmarks. There are lots of hills that resemble each other in shape, and there are thousands of trees that all resemble each other in shape. So I don't know if any of you do wild nature hiking. It's not actually recommended by the authorities to enter such an environment without any kind of compass or map and so on, but it is actually an interesting challenge if you do it. And it's very, very easy to get lost. So you have to really remember well which paths you've taken, and anything that makes any kind of bits of vegetation look unique to find your way back. And that's exactly the kind of challenge that a bee might face. So your nest might be in or under this tree that you can just so barely make out. I have deliberately chosen a foggy landscape here because, of course, it is not always sunny there. Sometimes it's cloudy or foggy or it rains. And bees still have to find their way reliably through this landscape. And your good nectar patch might be 1.5 kilometers away behind this hillock here, and there might be a pollen patch over here, again, within some trees that you can barely make out. So that's the general challenge. It's not a trivial task, especially not if you have a brain the size of a pinhead. Now, the way we study bee navigation these days is with this device called harmonic radar, where the bottom dish here emits a signal that is transponded to a different frequency. This is why this antenna-like thing is called a transponder. Bounces it back, and the signal, the reflected signal, is then picked up by the top dish here. And of course, using this radar technology, we can then know which direction and how far the bee is at any one time. And using this technology, because we're also now working towards tracking bees in 3 dimensions, using this technology, we can not only reconstruct where the bee is at any one time, but we can also take the view from the cockpit of the bee and see the world how the bee sees it while she's flying along these routes that we've tracked with the radar. This here is actually the route of an orientation flight of a honeybee drone. And you can see these 2 boomerang-shaped things are the views through a bee's eye. You can see it's very coarse pixelated. Actually, the spatial resolution of a bee eye is much lower than that of a human being, but bees compensate for that to some extent with by being able to process more information per unit time. So through subtle scanning movements, they can actually pick up spatial detail that normally their coarse pixelation of their eye optics would not allow them to see. And using this technology, we can confront a bee with various, well, not in this case quite natural, but nature-like challenges. And this is a challenge that is also familiar from the human domain, the traveling salesman problem. So as the name suggests, a salesperson has to face the task perhaps of visiting the shops of a particular chain, perhaps one particular bookstore in 5 different locations, for example, in the course of a day. And what you want to do is doing this in a way that minimizes travel distance and energy and fuel expenditure and so on. And because the number of possibilities goes up very steeply with the number of destinations. So for just the 5 destinations that you're seeing here, the number of possibilities is already 5 times 4 times 3 times 1. If you have 10 possibilities, then of course it's already a quite difficult task. And because bees normally can't fill up at just a single flower to fill their little honey stomach, they have to visit multiple, of course, and often multiple patches in a single flight to fill up once. They face the same problem as a traveling salesperson. That is, they have to find routes that minimize travel distance. And here on the left, you can see a simple version with 5 feeding locations and a hive. And a route taken by a not particularly experienced bee yet. You can see that her flight is clearly not yet optimal. She explores quite a bit outside the area here, but of course they can get better, and we'll look at that in a moment. I should say that The color coding here is such that green is always early in the path, yellow and orange is in the middle, and red is late. And I'll come back to this color code later on. Now let's see how with experience a bee gets better and better. So we're now following a single bee tracked with harmonic radar. She's now already found 2 locations, but keeps exploring for more. Of course, now she's found the second 2 and the 5th. So now she knows them all. We're now in flight number 11. We're following this bee for one flight after another, and in between, she always goes back. But with experience, you can see that the path becomes more and more streamlined until she ceases exploration outside the array. Oops. And in the end, indeed, she finds the optimal route and then just sticks with the best possible route, minimizing any further exploration. So bees are very good at solving simple versions of this traveling salesman problem. Now, what we're also interested in doing is to leave the bees to their own devices without setting them any particular task, and basically just following their lives from their maiden flight to their last flight. Every bees, typically worker bees, only live a few weeks. And in this particular study, we followed a few select bees for their entire path of life. And what we're seeing here in this video is indeed a bee's very first flight ever, when she leaves the nest for the first time and explores her environment. This is sped up quite a bit, by 130 times. The real flight lasts over 2 hours. And what you can see is that the bee always explores in different directions, flying back to near the hive, this point here, without entering it, just as if to sort of reset her bearings, say, all right, I still know where I am now, let's try a different direction. She flies in all kinds of different loops, always then returning to near the hive until she finally enters it again. And we can also see, and that will become of relevance later, that during this exploration, the bee also visits a forest edge with some flowers up here, and we'll come back to the relevance of it later in its CV, so to speak. Now we're on day 2, and the bee on its second day makes one more exploratory loop in a southwesterly direction. Green again is early, orange in the middle, and red is late. And after that, she's found something. And she now spends several dozen foraging flights, several days in fact, only visiting that particular flower patch, always returning to that same patch and flying back to her nest. So she's switched entirely from a phase of exploration to one of patch exploitation, where she now just harvests the goods from the patch that she's discovered. And then for a few days, the bee was stuck inside because it was raining. And after that, she flies to that patch a few more times. That's the one that she also visited several dozen times in her first week of foraging. And after that, so these are the green flights. Again, she returns to this familiar patch. After that, on a regular flight out to this patch, she appears to change her mind and then flies over to another patch that she had visited only once during her very first exploratory flight 10 days earlier, on day 1 of her career, so to speak, and then spends the rest of her days just with that patch and doing nothing but exploiting this second patch that she knew as a distant memory. And she flies there without further exploration, without retracing her steps back to the hive, but directly from a point halfway between the hive, the nest, and the other familiar patch. Then she just vanished along a regular flight, probably having been eaten by some insectivorous bird. So she was never seen again after that. So day 13 was a bad day for that particular bee. Other bees have very different CVs, so to speak. So there are some individuals that never stop exploring, but always interface patch exploitation with more exploration. They never seem quite satisfied and want always to look for something better. But this bee was basically just foraged from 2 patches over her entire career. Now, one criticism that I faced fairly early on from people working on primates and corvid birds and other sort of classical items of animal minds was, well, they said, yes, we believe that bees can learn about spatial positions and about colors and so on, because that's what a bee naturally does. She has to be programmed to learn such things. But they were not particularly impressed, because so they said, this is not actually probing the flexibility of bees to learn new things in the way we understand intelligence. And so quite early on, as a kind of side project, while I was doing my PhD on color vision in bees, we asked, or this was captured recently in a book by Brian Butterworth. He recounted that Chittka, then a PhD student in Germany, after perhaps too much whiskey, wondered whether bees could count. This actually is correct. I told him that because with a friend who had discovered a bottle of Tullamore Dew, an Irish whiskey, in the cupboard of his parents, we actually went on a whiskey-fueled brainstorming session and had this idea, hey, how about we test if bees can count? And this is how we did it. So we planted a number of tetrahedral landmarks, each 3.5 meters high, on a large open field. And the bees had to fly along 3 landmarks before landing at a feeding station. And we then produced various contradictions between the training distance and number, and tested where the bees would fly then. So specifically, we either increased the number of landmarks over the same distance, or we reduced it. And it turned out that the fewer landmarks there were, the further the bees would fly. And if we put more landmarks along the way, the bees would tend to undershoot the target, so to speak, and land earlier. So they were really guided, in addition to the learned training distance, by the number of landmarks. And more recently, we've tested bees in more other kinds of intelligence tests. I'll play you a little TV program from a recent show that actually featured our bees. Hopefully this works with audio. If you could briefly raise thumbs when you can hear something.
We've recently discovered something even more surprising about insects. It turns out that some are really, really smart. One test of intelligence in animals is when they're given a problem, they can work out a solution in their heads. Hang a piece of food from a perch, out of reach, and a smart bird like a raven soon works out what to do. Just pull the string, hold it with your foot, pull a bit more, and in no time at all, you have a snack. Yet anything a mere vertebrate can do. Bumblebees can also do this, even though they must be trained to solve the problem. Pull the string and reach a reward of nectar. Now, this bee hasn't been trained at all. But if she's allowed to watch her nestmate solving the problem, she knows exactly what to do when she gets her turn. Teachers and students, and all with brains only the size of pinheads. Combine this with the flexibility of the basic insect layout, and there's not much that insects can't do.
All right, so this is a string pulling task, and the social learning that was already mentioned in this Planet Insect documentary is shown here in a slightly different paradigm. So here we've paired a knowledgeable individual marked with a red dot with another individual that's never pulled a string for a reward before. And of course, as you might expect in this particular combination, the inexperienced individual then simply scrounges on the efforts of the experienced one. Now they're getting a bit antsy because they've actually emptied the nectar well. And you'll see now that the individual marked with the red dot in the video, the experienced one runs over to the next string. This one, the other one clearly has no idea what she's doing because she's still looking for nectar in the other well. But now they've pulled out the second artificial flower and they're drinking the nectar together again. But you do that, in this case, it's shown 4 times, the same process, but you do that a few times. And then the inexperienced individuals will also start pulling strings by themselves until the skill can spread through whole colonies. And this is what we've shown here in an analysis where we've arranged all the individuals of that particular bumblebee colony in a circle. So each dot is one individual. And whenever a line forms between 2 dots, that means there's an interaction between 2 individuals. Whenever the target individual has learned the task, the dot turns colored. So you can see now this unique skill that no other bumblebee has ever had to do in the evolutionary history of bees. This skill spreads through the entire colony like a social media meme in a human social network. So it's, in a sense, copied and passed on again and again. And you can now see that there are several. So this was on top here, the yellow 31 was the individual that mastered the task first. All the orange ones are ones that learned the task from yellow 31. And so you can now see there are a few purple dots here. These are not bees that have learned the task from yellow 31, but these bees have learned the task from the orange bees, so from the second generation of learners. And as this progresses, we have several sequential sets of workers, each learning the skill from a previous one without the need to get the original teacher involved, so to speak. And indeed, in this colony, the skill spreads even after the original innovator of the task has passed away. Bees only live a few weeks, so that usually happens during such experiments, that some bees don't see the experiment through its end. But so the point here is that it's a really a culture-like phenomenon of a new innovation that spreads through a colony of insects and can be passed on from one set of individuals to the next one. And once you have multiple string pullers in a colony, then you can see this is sped up, of course. You can see these amusing interactions where they almost appear to cooperate in pulling strings out to get the rewards in these artificial flowers in the central nectar wells. Now, a more advanced form of the string pulling task is shown here. This was recently done. This is still work in progress. It's not published, and we're still collecting data by Chao Wen in my lab, who asked whether bees spontaneously, if faced with these kinds of trick tasks, where, for example, there's one long but uninterrupted and a short interrupted string, can the bee then identify which string out of the 2 she must pull? And you've seen that she, in this case, picked the longer but continuous string. On the left side, there is a variation of this task where there's a long and diagonal and a short perpendicular but discontinuous string. And this bee is a bit flighty. She gives up a few times, but she always pulls on the correct string. She always pulls on the continuous one. And in the end, she makes it. So now that she's on the 3rd attempt, she pulls out the flower in its entirety. As I said, we still require a few more controls and data, but we're very amazed by this performance because a lot of animals they're not spontaneously able to solve this task when confronted with it. In fact, it's only other primates that spontaneously know what to do. Dogs, for example, can learn to cope with an interrupted string. So they'll try it, they figure out, okay, it doesn't work, and then they'll try the other one. But in this case, there's no trial and error involved. The bees spontaneously pick the correct string. Now, the next experiment, I'll ask Dame Jane Goodall to give the introduction.
The most recent example which blows people's minds is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee has been taught to roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. He rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as this little ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So they learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I'd love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
So this, for me, was very moving, because Jane Goodall and some others of her generation were, of course, for me, the inspiration to go into animal behavior in the first place. And for her to take note of our work and to say, hey, I'd like to be young now and study bees was quite amazing. So let me explain this experiment in a little more detail. So as Jane Goodall said, the idea of the task here is to manipulate an object, a little ball. We just pick balls because they're relatively easy to manipulate, but manipulate it in such a way as to maneuver it into the center. So in a sense, this is sort of equivalent to a human token use task, where you have to pick the right object, put it in the slot of a vending machine, for example, and then you get your reward out of it. But the social learning variation of this particular task, we actually played a trick on the interaction between what we call the demonstrator, the individual that already can do it, and the observer. And so here you can see there are 3 balls. And obviously the most straightforward or easiest way to solve the task, if the task is indeed get a ball into the goal area, the central yellow ring here, obviously the best way to do that is to pick the closest ball and move that into the center. But this experienced bee, this one here, knows that actually that doesn't work, because we've trained her to know that this ball and this ball are actually glued to the surface. They can't be moved, and that bee knows it. And so whenever she does return to the setup, she rolls the furthest ball. And once she's got it into the goal area, they both get their little nectar reward, which they share. Here you can also see the little number tags quite well that we're using to identify our bees and be able to keep track of who is who and who's learned what. And the question now is, so this observer bee has never rolled balls for reward before. How will she solve the task when she's now put on the spot without the demonstrator, and can now choose between 3 balls, which in this case are no longer glued down? And we're asking basically, will this observer bee ape the demonstrator? Will she just copy the actions that she has seen being performed? Or will she deliver a spontaneous improvement on what she's seen and pick instead the closest ball to maneuver it to the target area? And this is what she does. she does not simply copy the actions of the demonstrator and move this far away ball, but she moves the closest ball to the target area. And then, of course, she gets her nectar. And this shows to us that because the bees are not just copying actions, that there's actually some sort of understanding of the desired end state of the task, that is to have a ball in the central goal area, and that the bee, because she does not actually learn this by trial and error, she doesn't try the 3 balls and then finds out which one takes the longest or which one is the most energy efficient, but she spontaneously picks the closest ball and moves that to the target area. And that for us was, of course, very exciting, because it really does seem to show that they know what the desired outcome is of their activities. Now, we all know, of course, that bees are good at recognizing flowers, including their patterns, and different flowers have different shapes and color patterns and so on. But it turns out that actually, if I ask my computational biologists, the ones that work on how brains process information, is that this does not actually require that the bee stores a kind of mental image in its mind that that it can sort of recall and match to incoming information, because you can actually store the right flowers in memory by just memorizing certain edge orientations, the colors and so on. You don't necessarily have to have access to a kind of mental image inside your little head. But this is whether the bees can actually do that, whether they have access to a mental image, is what we explored in this experiment. I'll just flip on the lights because it's getting a little dark outside. So here we have an experiment where the bees have to learn a shape in one sensory modality and then access it in a different sensory modality. And in essence, the experiment that we're doing is a little similar to the perhaps now historic or outdated kiddie birthday party game where you were blindfolded or you had to reach into a bag with various objects and find the right object, like a spoon or a screwdriver or a key or something like that, that you had previously only seen. And this kind of cross-modal recognition of an object requires you to actually conjure up the object properties in your mind, because you've never been, in this case, exposed to the sensory qualities of the object before in that other modality. And so the bees here are learning to recognize, to distinguish balls and cubes. One group of bees learns balls, another one learns cubes. They're always cross-matched in such experiments. And then we're asking the same bees, can you now recognize that same shape in complete darkness? And importantly, while we're training them, they can only see but not touch these shapes. So they're under a plexiglass surface, so they can see them, and they get a reward if they found the right surface. The reward, as always, is a little droplet of sugar water. And then we're testing the same bees through under infrared light, which bees can't see any more than we do, and ask if they can now recognize the correct object by touch alone without seeing it. And indeed, it turns out that bees trained on the balls by seeing them, not touching them, can also recognize them by touch when they can't see them. And vice versa, we can also train the bees in darkness, so they're exposed to the tactile cues first, and subsequently test them under light. And indeed, in that case, when they now can no longer touch but see the objects, they're again capable of recognizing the correct objects. So indeed, it seems there is a kind of mental representation of a shape that they can access from different sensory modalities. Now, after all this work with balls, you might be unsurprised that we eventually ask the question, of whether they actually enjoy the activity of moving balls about. And this is what Samadhi Galpayage did as her PhD project. She indeed found out that the bees they even go out of their way to return to these balls again and again. And then roll balls again and again in this area. And perhaps unsurprisingly, young bees do this more than older bees, and perhaps equally unsurprisingly, male bees do it more than female bees. Male bees have a very easy life because they actually don't do any work for the colony, so they have more time on their hands, I guess, and so keep rolling balls even more than the worker bees. And there was no other reward involved. So we didn't give them sugar in this case. They actually made a detour to come back to this area and do some ball rolling. And this brings me to the last section of the talk, the perhaps most difficult to answer question of whether bees could be said to have emotions, whether they enjoy things, whether they suffer from things, and so on. And I should also say that perhaps 20, 30 years ago, people would have regarded this question as madness or at the very least unanswerable. I should say that when I was a young student, we had debates with senior neuroscientists who even claimed that animals like cats don't have any kind of consciousness or feelings, and said that, for example, the experience of pain requires consciousness, which only humans have. So they said, and they therefore said it's perfectly fine to operate on anesthetized tethered cats and insert electrodes into their brains and so on. The times have changed a little bit, and I think they're about to change for many more animals. But one experiment that opened my eyes in that direction a bit was one where we actually didn't look at sentience or emotions as a default. We were just interested in asking whether bees can learn about predation threat. And so one of the things that bees have to look out for are these crab spiders that lurk on flowers. Some of them can actually camouflage themselves by taking on the color of the flowers on which they prey. So there's a yellow spider on a yellow flower and a white spider on a white flower. And we took that situation into the laboratory to simply find out whether bees with experience learned to avoid spiders. And in nature, quite often, about 9 out of 10 times in such attacks, the bees manage to break away. They're obviously strong flyers. And such failed attacks, of course, give in nature an opportunity for learning about the threat. And we mimicked this situation by life-sized plastic models of these spiders combined with solenoid-driven pincers, where the bees would be briefly held between two sponge pads without any kind of injury. These are very soft pads, and we then wanted to find out if bees learn about this. And I have a little video of a bee exposed to that situation. Here, the bee lands on a safe flower, nothing happens, and now she makes a mistake. She lands on a flower with a crab spider. So this looked gruesome, but nothing bad happened to the bee in terms of any kind of physical damage. But what opened my eyes a little bit, so sure enough, the bees learned to avoid the threat. So especially if the spiders were conspicuous, they would subsequently make no more errors in visiting such flowers after such experiences. But the remarkable thing, well, there were several, but one was that their whole demeanor changed. So they would scan every flower, often for several seconds, before deciding about whether it was safe to land. But the most surprising phenomenon was an increase in false alarms. That is, a bee would scan a flower that was actually perfectly safe, where there was no threat, and then reject it as if they'd seen a ghost. So they would inspect all flowers, of course, after these experiences before landing, and in many cases their rejections were correct, so they would reject the flowers that had spiders on them, But these false alarms were visits where the bees responded to imagined threats that weren't actually there, that were only conjured up from memory. And that, to us at least, looked, well, remotely similar to humans with a kind of post-traumatic stress disorder, where you react to threats that are not currently there. But of course, it wasn't yet a formal test of any kind of emotional state. It just opened that possibility up to further exploration. And so how might one more formally explore emotion-like states in animals? So first of all, just to be clear that this is a difficult task in any animal because we do not have access to any kind of verbal report. In bees, no less or no more than in dogs or deer or sheep. But one approach that people who work, for example, with domestic animals have developed is to face the animal with ambiguous stimuli and then ask how they judge these. And the essence of such tests is basically the proverbial glass that's half full or half empty. So that's what's shown. Here it's an ambiguous stimulus that physically is neither here nor there, but if you're an optimist, you might judge the situation as, hey, this is pretty good, there's still a lot in there, and have a good time. Whereas the pessimist looks at the same physical stimulus and says, it's already almost empty, and be all sad about it. And this proverbial situation is one that people in other domestic animals have used to explore whether, for example, these animals are kept in conditions that are conducive to their psychological well-being or not, as the case may be. And here's how we adapted this paradigm to the world of bees. So again, we have artificial flowers, so to speak. The bee flies into a little flight arena, and she finds at the end some flowers that can be either blue or green, and she learns with time that blue is good and rewarding. There's a sugar reward there. That's our positive stimulus, P for positive. And when there's green, there is no reward. So that's the negative stimulus. And we then ask, after you've learned this, how do you judge such ambiguous stimuli that are halfway between blue and green in this case? So that's their glass 50% filled situation. And we're asking the bees, do you judge this as more likely being a good thing or not? And after the bees have been trained, they know blue is good, green is not. They will always fly in a very straight path to the blue stimulus without much hesitation. So that's a typical flight track. Whereas if you present them with green, they'll fly about the arena for a great deal of time before they finally, after a great deal of hesitation, will say, all right, well, if you're not offering me anything else, and I might as well try this green thing, but I'll only do it after a great deal of hesitation. That's the convoluted flight path that you're seeing on the right. Then the question is, how do bees judge the intermediate, the ambiguous, the turquoise stimulus? And it turns out that this depends fundamentally on what happened before the experiment. So if we're giving the bees a little surprise reward, a little 5 microliters, before they're even starting the test, then they will judge the ambiguous stimulus as more likely being a good thing than if they had not received that reward. And the data are shown here on the right side. So here's the positive stimulus, very short latencies to enter, as you can see with this flight path. Either way, the bees will fly there very fast. Here's our negative stimulus, green on the right, and only after almost 2 minutes on average will bees accept that negative stimulus. So the interesting thing is what happens to the ambiguous stimuli. And if you look at the red curve here, these are the bees' responses for the medium and also the neighboring positions here for the turquoise stimulus, depending on whether or not the bees had been given that surprise reward. If they'd not had it, their hesitation to accept turquoise is almost as long as for the negative stimulus. Whereas if they previously had this surprise reward, they'll accept it, the ambiguous stimulus, much faster than they otherwise would. And it turns out you can also do the opposite, that, and Geraldine Wright at Oxford University has done an experiment where she's given the bees a simulated predator attack before they entered. And in that case, the entire curve is shifted in the opposite direction. So the ambiguous stimulus will now be met with greater reservation, and bees thinking, this doesn't look quite safe to me at all. And it turns out that the positive emotion-like state, the optimistic state that we're measuring here, is dopamine dependent, as it is in humans. And dopamine blocker will take away the optimistic state that the bees are in after they've received a little surprise reward. So at least by the same criteria that people are using for domestic animals and also wild animals, the bees at least qualify by displaying similar behavior that are consistent with the assumptions of positive and negative emotion-like states. Now, a tiny outlook on a tiny insect brain. You might think that perhaps bees' brains are simply too small or have too little complexity to contain any such thing as sophisticated as a mind. Now, they're indeed small, but they are beautifully miniaturized in all of their components. So here's a frontal view of a bee brain. You can see the bee's eyes here and the antenna. These are a bee's noses. So this is the organ that she uses for chemosensation, smell, and taste. And these areas shaded in light blue are the optical visual ganglia, lamina, medulla, and lobula that are computational relays to process visual information. This sort of what looks like an old-fashioned telephone dial is the so-called antennal lobe. This processes olfactory information from the antenna, and both the visual area and the olfactory, the antennal lobes send neural cables to the so-called mushroom bodies. These are dorsal structures, perhaps roughly equivalent with a human cortex, with lots of convolutions that function in memory storage and multisensory integration. Now, the entire brain has fewer in honeybees than 1 million neurons, so it is really a very low neuron number compared to a human's 85 billion, and that perhaps might mislead one to think that there is a lack of complexity until you actually look at what these nerve cells look like. Here's a single one of them. Here's one nerve cell that actually constitutes the reward pathway in a bee's brain. And you can see the cell body is down here, and all the branching, the wiring of that neuron is as finely differentiated as perhaps a fully grown tree, except of course very, very small. So it has branchings in the antennal lobe, in the lateral, what's called the lateral horn of the brain, and also throughout the entire mushroom bodies. Each individual such nerve cells has up to several thousand, about 10,000 connection points, synapses with other nerve cells. And this means that the entire wiring diagram of a bee's brain is still way outside what we can comprehensively understand in these bees. People now have relatively complete wiring diagrams for some simple worms that have only a few hundred neurons, but here we're still a long way away from understanding the circuitry comprehensively. And this was recognized early on by the first people who actually looked at brains, including insect brains. So here's a citation from Santiago Ramón y Cajal and Domingo Sanchez, who not just looked at human brains and those of other animals, but in fact, over a century ago, at insect brains. And here's what they found. So by the way, this is a drawing, an over a century-old drawing of a bee visual system by Ramón y Cajal. Here's the eye, the retina, and here's the lamina, medulla, and lobula. And you can see several types of neurons that they had already identified back then. It's really amazing how the staining techniques by which they managed to identify these neurons is just fantastic. And here's what they said, Ramon y Cajal and his colleague, about insect brains. The excellence of the psychic machine does not increase with zoological hierarchy. Instead, one realizes that in fish and amphibians, the nervous centers have undergone an unexpected simplification. Of course, their gray matter has increased considerably in mass, but when the structure of their brains is compared with that of bees or dragonflies, they're excessively plain, coarse, and rudimentary. It is as if one were to pretend to hold as equals the merits of a rough grandfather clock with the quality of a fine pocket watch, a marvel of fineness, delicacy, and precision. As always, in building her marvelous works, nature distinguishes herself much more in her tiny creations than in the large. So, some general conclusions. So I think we have convincing evidence that indeed have representations, mental representations of space and of things in space. But they do display simple, at least tool-use object manipulation with an awareness of the possible outcomes of their own interactions. They don't solve them by trial and error, but by thinking, by some kind of internal process, and come to the solution without actually trying different ones. They also appear to have flexible access to autobiographical memories, as we showed with our navigation experiments where we followed bees with harmonic radar. And at least by the same criteria that are also applied to vertebrate animals, we're not lowering the bar. Bees appear to attach emotion-like states to rewarding and punishing settings. And that, I think, imposes on us some obligation to conserve the environments that have shaped these unique minds. They're small and they're different, very different minds to ours. But I think many people are now aware that there's a need to conserve pollinators because of their utility for us, because they do something useful. They pollinate our crops and wildflowers and so on. But that's a fairly human-centric argument. It's the idea that we can't do without them. But I think when people think about the conservation of Siberian tigers and so on, then there is an element of empathy. We engage with the conversation because we feel for their plight. We feel that these animals must suffer from their dwindling numbers, from the difficulty of finding suitable habitats and mating partners and so on. And that approach is not yet, I think, widespread in insect conservation. I think what we have now learned about the intelligence and perhaps the at least plausibility of emotion-like states in insects gives us another angle why I think we need to respect them and aid and help in their conservation. All right, I'll stop here. So if you've enjoyed this, I've got a book out on this topic where there's more detail inside, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lars, for your presentation. Really interesting. I knew bees were smart, but I didn't realize they were this smart. Yeah, so I'd like to open it up to everyone. Before that, though, I'd just like to use my privileged position as a host to ask a question myself, if that's okay with you, which is what I found very interesting is the fact that bees play. And I saw that you wrote a paper on that. Could you expand a little bit more on that? Just because I know mammals, at least, I know cats and dogs play, but I never thought of insects playing. So, and an opposition of that, do bees get bored? You said that male bees don't work compared to the female bees. So are they just bored bees?
A good question. We don't know is the honest answer. So in nature, I would imagine there's very little of the luxury that might be required to allow play behavior in either bees or indeed many other animals, because you're busy all day long with securing sufficient food, and in the case of bees, to generate a surplus of food that in some species will also not just help you through a rainy day, but through an entire winter, for example. And because of this, of course, the first observation of play behavior in most animals were done in captive or domestic animals, where the animals are typically provided with ad libitum food, so they don't have to fight for it all day long. And only later, once people were sufficiently primed of the possibility of play behavior, was it observed also in nature. So we don't know yet, as we don't with many other animals, whether there is an equivalent of this behavior under natural conditions, and whether perhaps it shows increased widespreadness, for example, when there's ample food rather than in conditions of dearth, or when it's harder to find food. Good question. We don't have the answer yet.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lars. And yes, let's please open it up. As usual, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function on Zoom under reactions at the bottom of your screen. We're not that many. If you physically raise your hand, I might be able to spot you. Otherwise, just write the question in the chat and I can read it out for you. I can see Bernard already has his hand up. Please come in.
Lars, thank you so much. Your lecture is absolutely enthralling, and I knew a little bit about your work, but I hadn't seen the details, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I should say that I'm actually a colleague of yours. I'm at Queen Mary College, but in the physics department.
All right.
So I hope I'd love to come and visit your group sometime, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Just down the road. I had a question. Obviously, you've been talking about the mind of a bee in the singular, and I think most of your slides were talking about individual bees. I think there was a case where you had two bees that demonstrated bees, but it was mainly individual bees. But I'm also interested in the question of whether there is a sort of collective mind, because you get the impression with termites at least that there's a sort of collective intelligence, and which is important to the survival of the colony. So when it comes to bees, is there also a collective mind in some sense, or is that like a different area of research?
That's a very good question. So there are many aspects of social insect behavior which at least look as if there is some sort of coordinated activity, a coordination of multiple individuals towards the same good, as for example in nest construction, but also especially where bees as a whole swarm choose a new home, where tens of thousands of individuals collectively decide on a single new destination for where to locate with the swarm. And in doing that, they collect information about different options, and in the end, the whole swarm decides on one particular location. However, it turns out that many of these kinds of behavior routines that you find in such collective decision-making are largely hardwired. And so it looks clever, but it is in a sense no cleverer than, let's say, the human immune system, which collectively detects threats and can develop a memory for certain threats that it can then sort out. But it's, in fact, it's a fairly decentralized system where there's no actual collective mind. There's nothing that it feels like to be the swarm. It feels like something to be an individual in the swarm, perhaps like an individual human who has a good time in a crowd, as say in a football stadium, and everyone cheers together. But that too, to an alien observer, might look like some collective action where humans generate Mexican waves and so on. But each individual is the unit of the experience and also of the intelligence. And I think that's the same in humans as well as in bees.
So you would say there isn't really a collective mind for the bees, but I suppose you could, I mean, you could obviously ask the same question about humans. In what sense is there a collective mind for humans? And because what's interesting about your talk, you've shown that in some ways bees are rather like humans. They're not as separate as you might think. So I guess the same question could, well, I mean, I guess all the same issues arise in talking about the collective mind of humans as the collective minds, if such a thing exists, of bees.
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
But thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you, Bernard. Would anyone else like to come in for a question or even a comment? Valjean.
You might still be muted, Valjean.
Yeah, Valjean had this problem yesterday of trying to join in and unmute.
Should we do like yesterday then? That was to
Maybe,
put that
yeah.
out, go to Viola, and then we'll come back to you. Viola.
Okay, I have two questions. Thinking about the swarm, is that something like the murmuration of birds, and does it serve like the same function? And the other question is about the hexagonal pattern of the mathematical thing. Is that can bees do mathematics and geometry? And that I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. So let's start with the first question. So the swarm and consensus building in the swarm is actually quite a bit more advanced and complicated in bees than it is in bird swarms. So what happens is that unlike many other animals, it's the old bees that leave the native hive to find a new home. And so several 10,000 of them together with the old queen leave the hive and fly initially not too far. So they will fly to a nearby tree or an overhanging cliff or sometimes a building, and the swarm gathers not too far from the native home. But then the difficult thing starts, because they have to find a cavity, a suitably sized cavity which is not too wet, not too dry, with a suitably sized opening and so on. So from this swarm, while it's sitting there as a cluster for several days often, you will find swarms that distribute over a territory of several square miles. They fly several miles away from the swarm and come back with information about locations that they've discovered. And then what they'll use is something called the bee dance language. It's a repeated motion pattern by which they can, in a symbolized form, tell other individuals how far and in what direction a particular destination of interest is. So an individual scout might say they're pointing to a destination 3 kilometers to the north, and another one might point 2 kilometers southeast. And so initially, because different individuals have found different locations, there'll be quite a bit of disagreement. Some individuals will advertise one location, others a second location, yet others a third location, and so on. So initially, you find lots of opinions on that swarm for different locations. And then when you observe this process for several days, you will find that some locations fade from popularity, others will increase in popularity until more and more and more individuals in their dances will indicate a particular destination. And once there's more or less complete agreement, the whole swarm lifts off and they fly together to the target destination. And so this is it. I mean, Tom Seeley, who's researched this phenomenon, has actually referred to honeybee democracy in this consensus decision-making. The way it works is actually quite interesting, because there's no one who counts the votes, there's no government, the queen doesn't make the decision. It works by a fairly decentralized process, which means that the individuals that have found the best destinations will advertise it for longer. So a bee that has found a cavity that's so-so, that's actually just so acceptable, but you never know, you might not find a better one. She might indicate it like there, and then abandon the indication. So she won't have many followers. Whereas a bee that's found a really great location will indicate it over and over and over again, sometimes for many minutes, going there. And it turns out that the consensus building essentially works by a stochastic process where it's simply more likely that an uninformed individual will bump into a scout with better information because that scout will advertise it for a longer period, right? So because those scouts with the best information will advertise it for longest, if you're just randomly walking about the swarm, you're more likely to bump into a well-informed individual that has good information than you are to bump into one that has so-so information. And then the whole process snowballs because individuals following these dances of the best informed individuals will try them out themselves, come back to the swarm, and also advertise them for longer. And this means that in the end, everyone agrees on the same destination. And so this is what happens in a bee swarm. I think it's in a sense, I mean, starling murmurations look fantastic, but actually the decision-making in the bee is by far more complex.
Yeah, sure.
The way that honeycomb is constructed is a different cup of tea, because in that case you actually have to manipulate materials and put slivers of soft wax into particular locations to ultimately arrive at the kind of beautiful regularity that you find there. So this is something that to some extent has to be hardwired. Bees have to know already how to build hexagonal combs, and no honeybees ever build triangular cells or something like this. So to some extent they know from birth how to build them. But of course they can be faced with various complex challenges, as in these historic experiments that I showed, where somehow the whole building group has to decide collectively to build a curve into the comb and in which direction to build it, and how that consensus is achieved rather than every individual now building some different structure. There has to be some sort of agreement on which direction do we turn into. That's not yet been researched how that functions.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
All right.
There's just a follow-up question that came from the chat from what you've just said, just about the swarm moving, saying there. How do you determine that they are saying there? What do they actually do to do that?
I wish I had a little slider video for this. So the dance, it's called the dance language, because the bees actually go through a repeated movement pattern in the darkness of the hive on their vertical comb. And so what they'll do, the dance roughly takes the shape of a figure 8, where only the central bit of the 8 is a bit extended. Actually, they dance they sort of walk along a line, then do a semicircle to one side, then walk along the same line, make a semicircle to the other side, and so on. And they repeat this multiple times over. And the core piece of the most information-laden piece of this dance is this central run in the middle of the figure 8. And the longer this run, the further in the distance is the food, roughly to the equivalent, if that 1 second of going straight ahead before making that semicircle is about 1 kilometer, 2 seconds is 2 kilometers, 5 seconds is 5 kilometers. So the longer this waggle run in the center of the figure 8, the further away is the food. Slightly more complicated bit is the distance information. So again, you have to remember this is all in the darkness of the hive on the vertical comb. And the angular orientation of the waggle run on the comb, it contains the direction, to the extent that if the waggle run points straight up, that tells other bees to fly in the direction of the sun once they're outside the hive. If, on the other hand, the waggle run points straight down, that tells other bees fly in the opposite direction of the sun. And any angle, of course, can be expressed in between. So 90 degrees to the direction of gravity. So a lateral waggle run means, let's say, 90 degrees to the right of the current position of the sun, and so on. So the angle relative to gravity of the dance inside the hive or on the swarm, depending on where it's displayed, tells other bees about the direction of the food relative to the sun, whereas the duration of that waggle run tells other bees about the distance of the destination.
Wow, that's quite incredible. I can see Valjean now is unmuted, so
Yeah.
let's go to you.
Thank you. Sorry, I pushed several times on the icon that doesn't respond always. This talk just grows more and more amazing, and your research is phenomenal. Perhaps I'm asking this too soon because there's time for many more questions, but when you autopsy a bee, do you know why they die? They have a relatively short lifespan.
I've often asked myself this question, actually, what happens in the moment of an insect death? Is it that their little hearts give out or some sort of stroke-like phenomenon? I don't know is the honest answer. So my work focuses on the behavior of living insects, but it's a very good question, and I don't think it's one that science has the answer to.
So you don't see any physical evidence or change in their inner structure, or is it just exhaustion? I mean, they do an awful lot of work.
They do, and the more work they do, the shorter they live. So a bee turns over rather fantastic amounts of energy during her flight, even compared to hummingbirds, which are otherwise the most energy expensive flyers. And so that shows the more they fly, the more they work, the shorter they live.
Thank you.
So, I mean, there are many sort of obvious causes of death. One of the most worrying ones for us, external causes, is, of course, the pesticides that humans tend to coat their agricultural plants with. But how this what happens to the bee internally, what actually is the ultimate cause of death, is less easy to appreciate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Valjean. Next, I can see Niels has his hand up. Hi, Niels.
Hi. Very interesting. I took note of you talking about the traveling salesman. This is one of these things that haven't really been solved mathematically or and I'm also thinking about in the brain they have found these grid cells, a bit like a triangulation in the space where you are. I wonder if that also is in 3D. It's easy to imagine it on a flat ground, but could there be sort of cubic-like grid cells in the bee's brain? They seem to have enough space to actually have that, as far as I can see from the structure of it. Yeah. So it's also P equal NP complete. You must have heard of that. But could that change if we had a mathematical understanding of that? Could that change the way we would research these things? Because there's a kind of thing with electromagnetic, like attraction is something that is often the solution to some of these things. So that I don't know if, I mean, there are several questions in that. Could
Yeah.
you? I'm sure you have quite some understanding of that.
Yeah. So to start with the traveling salesman problem, indeed, as you say, the only mathematical solution to solve that problem is to go through all the iterations. And of course, that there are really lots of them, especially if the number of destinations is relatively high. And remarkably, the bees do not try out all the available routes. They try a good number, but after they've tried about, well, in this case of the 5 destination or 6-point solution, including the hive, they tried about 10 different solutions before zeroing in on one, which was invariably either the best or second best or third best. So it is not a full computation. They don't locate all the destinations, then start thinking and then just start flying a route. They try a subset of the available ones and then zero in on one of them, which tends to be either the best or the closest, but they get there by some partial iteration. Do they have grid cells in the same way as rodents?
There would be 3D grid cells, wouldn't there, as supposed to just be in a plane?
Because they fly in
they are, in air, yes.
So my neuroscientist colleagues are very interested by that very question, and I know they are looking specifically at the central complex, a part in the central brain, where several pathways converge and which is already known to be involved in navigation. I don't think that they found an equivalent of grid cells yet, but indeed, as you say, their existence is very likely, I think.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Niels, for coming in. Do you have anyone else who would like to make a comment or contribution? Oh, Alan, hi.
Hi. Lars, thank you for such an engaging presentation. Can I just ask a very general question? Could you tell us about the queen bee in terms of mind, relationships, emotion, or what's been discovered?
Good question. So, I mean, the queen, of course, is a very precious individual inside the hive, and they spend much of their lives as kinds of cave animals, not leaving the hive. So very few people have actually looked at their behavior for these reasons. One interesting observation that was made early on by Maurice Maeterlinck and so on a century ago already was that the queen's brain, in honeybees at least, is relatively small in proportion to her large body size, which perhaps is in line with the fact that she doesn't, for example, have to engage with flower foraging at all. In bumblebees, the queens also visit flowers, and honeybees, they do not. So the queen's life perhaps is less laden with all kinds of learning and memory challenges compared to worker bees, in fact. But there are a few very interesting things, of course, that go on, especially early in a queen bee's life. So you might perceive the honeybee hive as an epitome of peaceful coexistence and collaboration. But a queen's life actually starts quite Shakespearean in that the first thing that a queen does when she first emerges from the pupa is try to kill all of her sister queens, the other ones that are also coming up. And only if she wins these battles has she got a chance to be the next queen. And so that's part of what a queen does. Then, of course, there are the mating flights, where over a series of several flights outside the hive, the queen mates, and in her case, with dozens of male partners. The male bee or drone, as you might know, dies in the process immediately after mating. So no male bee ever mates with more than one individual. The queen mates with several dozen males. But this period only lasts for a few days, and the queen then lives the rest of her days largely inside the hive, and turns into an individual whose main function is just egg laying. And only intermittently, that is when there is a swarm, the old queen will leave with the swarm. So they have to retain their flight ability. And so some exciting things happen very early in a bee queen's life for very brief periods, but psychologically they have not been investigated. But I would imagine that the aggression that is involved with, for example, seeking out and then killing in duels her competitors and so on, must come with some sort of unique emotion-like state, as probably the extensive partying during her early days when she mates with lots of males also does.
And if the queen unexpectedly dies, what happens then?
It depends on whether the colony has the possibility to raise a new queen. And so this is to some extent decided by the workers, because there's actually no genetic difference between the queens and the worker. It's only a question of diet. And so normally what happens in a healthy hive is during the times of the summer, when there's the biggest surplus of floral food, the colony will raise several new queen larvae. They're raised in special wax pots where they're also given special nutrition. And it's this nutrition that that determines whether a bee turns into a worker or a queen. So they have to have the possibility that there is this kind of surplus of food, and there have to be some fertilized eggs still around that can be moved into the special cradle that is destined for the queens. If that's not the case, then eventually the colony will die.
That's incredible. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Alan. And next, let's invite Mary Lynn. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, what a delightful talk. I was thinking, as you were showing the slides of your experiments with the string pulling, for example, whether there are other labs in other countries that are replicating this sort of experiment. And I'm thinking of this in conjunction with Rupert Sheldrake's oft, I think he's still pulling out this example of the rats in Australia, the rats in Boston, whichever lab got their rats trained first around the world, they would learn faster and faster. And it seemed as though that, for example, the string pulling would be something that would freshen the data for Rupert if it was able to be replicated in other countries.
Yeah, so I'm afraid no support for Rupert Sheldrake's ideas from our bee work. So indeed, there are now a good number of labs working with similar kinds of flight arenas and similar paradigms, and they find similar results, but they do not find that somehow their bees have an acceleration of picking up these new skills if these experiments have already been done previously in other labs. So the bees have to learn it from scratch in these other labs, and they do so with the same kind of speed and end up with the same proficiency, but they're not actually better at it.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Lynn. Beth, do you have a question?
Yeah, this just opened my eyes so much. Now I'm all full of curiosity. I wonder what is the structure of the inside of the hive like, and what do bees do at night? do the bees require a rest period like sleep, like most animals would? And is there anything you can say about that kind of we've been talking about the daytime functions, but what about the rest of the time?
Yeah, so they need sleep. It's a very good question. We actually wondered about this because some bumblebee species actually operate north of the polar circle under conditions of permanent daylight. And we thought that under these Arctic conditions, when the whole period for colony growth and nectar harvesting is so short, that there might be pressure for them to work around the clock. And there might be, but they don't follow that pressure because they still sleep. And so even under conditions of 24 hours daylight, bees still sleep for about 6 to 8 hours. Not too different from humans, actually. There are various sleep stages, as I guess also in humans, where they can be distinguished by the bee's particular posture. When they're really deeply asleep, they're crouching down low and their antennae are way down. Their breathing rhythm goes down by quite a bit. And also people have looked at brain oscillations, which also show, in line with human REM sleep and so on, different phases. Do bees dream? We don't know this yet, but there are some interesting observations. So for example, this communication system, the bee dance that I had mentioned earlier, of course, makes no sense on the face of it to deliver at night because there's no foraging going on. They don't leave the hive when it's dark. But you intermittently find dancing bees that actually seem to wake up and display dances for certain food locations spontaneously, as if they were just thinking about them out of context. And the function of this is not yet clear, but then the function of dreams in humans is also not clear yet. My PhD supervisor, Randolph Menzel, has also found that sleep seems to have a function in memory consolidation. That is, that if the bees have learned certain odors, to associate odors with a reward during the day, then if you blow the same odor gently into the hive at night while all the bees are sleeping, then the bees have a better memory of these odors the next day. So somehow this information, even though they're seemingly still and sleeping, enters their memory and they respond to the odors better the next day.
So something else, you talked about what it requires to develop a queen, but what does it take something special to develop the drones?
Yes, so drones on the one hand and workers and queens are distinguished by their chromosome sets, and drones are haploid, that is, they have only one set of chromosomes. And so they come from unfertilized eggs. So the idea of virgin birth, while in humans, I think it's still contested the last time I looked, in bees, it's an everyday phenomenon. So an unfertilized egg, where the queen just lays an egg that has no sperm added to it, turns into a drone. And so the drone has just a single set of chromosomes. They're also fatherless, so they only have a mother, the drones. Whereas the workers and queens are the result of regular combination of genetic material from father and mother and are therefore diploid.
So then do the bees have some way to recognize how many eggs need to be fertilized so that they can become this? Or, how do they determine how many queens to develop, how many drones and how many workers? Is there some way in which they determine that?
Yeah. So you ask excellent questions. So the decision, interestingly, is not made by the queen, but by the workers. And so the most of the year, or the summer months, the bees largely build comb of the same size, both for worker eggs and also for honey storage. For drones and queens, they need to build differently sized and differently shaped cells. And so this happens, drones and new queens are produced during the peak of the flowering period when there's lots of surplus food. And the drone cells are built slightly larger. They're still hexagons, but they're slightly larger because the drones are larger than for the ones that are destined for worker bees. And it's the workers that take the first step by building the cells the right size for the males. And then the queen comes along and lays eggs, unfertilized ones, into the larger cells, and fertilized ones for workers into the smaller cells. And it's quite spectacular, but the error rate that the queen makes in positioning fertilized versus unfertilized eggs into the right cells is virtually zero. So they make no errors. When there's a larger male destined cells, the queen makes a son. She lays an unfertilized eggs. When she encounters a worker-sized cell, she'll put a fertilized egg. Imagine that as humans, you have complete control over whether your next offspring is male or female. Honeybees do it.
So do you say that is part of their hardwiring, or is that part of their spontaneous behavior? You know, the whole process of determining what size the cell is going to be, etc.
So for all we know, much of these activities are hardwired. They're displayed in all bee colonies, honeybee colonies, to the same extent, and there doesn't seem to be the need to learn them, and there doesn't seem to be any individual variation. So there is still, in addition to all this individual learning behavior that I made the center of my talk, there are also, of course, a huge diversity of innate, hardwired behavior routines that you also find in bees. All right.
Thank you, Bear. And next we have a question from the chat, Mary France asks, how do you compare the very beautiful, moving and poetic writings of Maurice Maeterlinck with your contemporary findings? I hope that's how you pronounce it.
Yes. Well, I mean, I wish I could write like Maeterlinck, is all I can say. Of course, this wasn't a fictional work. This was actually a work about the biology and the current state of, or the then current state of knowledge of bee biology that Maeterlinck summarized, albeit in very poetic terms. And I just have to take my hat off to that generation of science writers, including, of course, also Jean-Henri Fabre and Darwin, of course, who write in amazingly beautiful ways that we don't seem to be taught or teach anymore, where we now have such an emphasis on dry and unornamental scientific writing.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Marie France. Jorge, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I would just like to go back a bit to a former question about swarm intelligence. So my question is whether you could elaborate a bit on this, because it really seems that bees engage in collective improvisation or even collective, random flight to solve specific problems. But seems you imply that it is not the best example of what we would call swarm intelligence. And I'm also interested in the implications of this for teaching and learning, even mathematics education.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, I share everyone's fascination with the intricacies of the kind of collective decision making that goes on inside a bee swarm. The fact that scouts with conflicting and contradictory information bring back the information to the swarm, that there is disagreement for some time until a consensus is reached, of course, superficially looks almost like the decision making that you might find in a human brain, where you collect conflicting ideas and then make up your mind about them and so on. My reservation is to put this on the same level of intelligence that goes on in individual brains, because it turns out that, of course, much of the swarm behavior is the result of innate behavior routines. So the swarm, the bee swarm that you observe today solves the same problem in the same way as a bee swarm that you might have observed 3 million years ago had you been around then. And so the thing there is, as opposed to the kinds of intelligence tests which we confront individuals with, which are challenges that no individual in the evolutionary history of bees has ever had to solve, let's say, such as the ball rolling or the string pulling task, is the swarm can't do anything new. The swarm can't solve an entirely new problem that's never been confronted before. It can, of course, find new destinations where no bees have ever been nested, but there's no shift in quality of the kind of information that can be debated in the swarm, so to speak, or no novelty in the decision making. So as sophisticated a behavior it is, I would hesitate to attribute a kind of collective mind to it.
I see. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Let's, Bernard, you had something else to add.
Yeah, yes, I could ask another question, a rather trivial one, though. I mean, my understanding is that there are actually many thousands of species of bees. So is the behavior you're describing common to all species, or are you just focusing on a particular species in your experiments?
Another very good question. So we're mostly focusing on a tiny minority of species, that is social ones for sheer convenience, because they're easier to keep in laboratories and to obtain reasonable sample sizes with. Even within the social species, ours are only a tiny minority. So there are about 300 different species of bumblebees, of which I have worked with about 10. There are about a dozen different species of honeybees, of which I've only worked with a single one. But in addition, there are another about 300 species of so-called stingless bees, all of which are in the tropics, often with extremely fascinating and diverse biologies and nesting architecture. So you might think of all bees as flower visitors. Some of these stingless bees are actually carnivorous. There are others that actually eat feces, that specialize in collecting feces for food. And some munch on decaying bodies and so on. So there's a fascinating diversity of food, of architectures. So some stingless bees build horizontal combs. Some of them build spiral-shaped combs. And some of them build bizarre fake nests in which they put diluted honey to deter predators such as ants and so on. So just among the social bees, there's a lot of diversity that, of course, I haven't been able to capture in this talk. Then, in addition, there are thousands of solitary bees that build the nest as individual females, and they just look after a very limited number of offspring in these nests. And again, there's a huge diversity of bees, some of which build their nests in abandoned snail houses and so on.
So really, the bees sound as complicated as humans in terms of their diversity of behaviors.
Indeed, if not more so, yes. There's a huge diversity of nesting biologies, feeding, specialization, social systems, communication systems, and so on.
But presumably there are some features which all the species have in common, I mean, in terms of their behavior, I suppose, but or maybe it just isn't known because it hasn't been studied.
So some, yes. So all of them, the vast majority at least, share the fact that they have a home. So a home base where they provision their young. Even there's some variation because there are certain species that are parasitic and steal food from other bees. But yes, so for example, the common perception that all bees visit flowers, there are exceptions and quite dramatic ones with the carnivorous bees.
And finally, I mean, obviously you're only talking about bees, but there are all the multitude of other insect species as well. I mean, are there commonalities between the different insect species, or is there in some sense in which bees are the sort of the most, I don't know if you can use the word intelligent, but you know, the top of the hierarchy, or how does one compare different species, or is it just too complicated a question?
It is a difficult question, but perhaps not one that's unanswerable. So of course you can look at other species and their learning abilities as well. Of course, there is lots of work on learning and memory in fruit flies because they're so conveniently studied because of the diversity of molecular genetic tools that you have in that case. But they're really dense. So that I doubt very much that you can train a fruit fly to roll a ball to a particular destination, let alone make them pick it up by observing conspecifics. But they have simple forms of learning and memory. But I think bees are not necessarily alone. So there are very impressive examples from wasps, for example. There are certain species of wasps of the genus Polistes where they have very individualized facial features. And it turns out that the individuals of the colony recognize individually by their faces the other individuals of their nest. And not only that, but they attach quite a bit of information to these facial memories that they have. So they know the fighting abilities of other wasps. They can even infer by watching two other white wasps fight how they stand in their fighting strength relative to the wasps that they've been watching.
Finally, I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions, but if, for example, a bee colony meets a wasp colony, is it a state of war or do they learn to collaborate?
I've never seen a case of collaboration. So wasps, unlike the bees, of course, are after the meat and also the carbohydrates that the bees collect. So they like honey, of course, as well. And so usually there's a fight ensues, but with varied outcomes. So some strategies of bees, including in Japan, for example, there are finger-long hornets. They're much bigger than ours that raid bees' nests. But if the bees get a hold of them and can pin them down, they can actually cook the wasps, the hornets, to death by surrounding the hornet with a bowl of bees and then heating their body temperatures using their flight muscles to a temperature with which the hornet can't cope. So it's this kind of battle can go either way.
Oh, it's fascinating. Well, I hope to visit you sometime because I've got lots of other questions. But
anytime. All right.
Fascinating.
Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, really incredible. So we have reached the top of the hour. So I guess we should really start wrapping up. Lars, is there anything you would like to give us before we close the session? Any final remarks?
Well, I mean, I have to say this idea of having a full hour of discussion has been amazing. So often the chairperson closes the discussion after 50 minutes, and so in this case, there've been so many actually very unexpected for me and highly interesting question that's made it really enjoyable for me to have this second hour of the whole event. So thank you very much. It's a brilliant idea to organize it this way.
Great, thank you, Lars. I'm
It's
pleased
a
you had a
wonderful
great
audience.
time. I know I certainly did, and I'm sure everyone else here did too. So really, thank you so much. It was really, really interesting to learn all about bees. So we have now reached the end of the first weekend of the series Incredible Minds. Next week we will have Dr. Michael Levin, who will talk to us about the collective intelligence of cells during morphogenesis, what bioelectricity outside the brain means for understanding our multi-scale nature. And then on Sunday, we will have Dr. Julia Mossbridge talking about human thinking and human being. So I hope to see you all then. You're obviously all invited. Until then, you can always contact us on our website. We've got a contact us section, or email us directly at eleanor@paricenter.com. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Lars. And we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center. Bye-bye.